This show is listener supported. You can join us and help our show grow to support more adoptees by going to adopteeson.com/partner. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 121, Dr. Sue Green. I'm your host, Haley Radke. I am honored to introduce you today to Dr. Sue Green, a psychologist from Australia who was actively involved in the landmark Victorian Adoption Act of 1984. Sue will share her personal story with us, and then we dig into what led her to become an adoptee advocate who now teaches other therapists and mental health professionals how to truly be adoptee-competent in working with our loss and trauma. We also touch on some interesting facts about adoption in Australia that will likely surprise you as they did me. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are over on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to the podcast Dr. Sue Green. Welcome, Sue.
Hi, Haley. Very excited to be with you.
Yes,
the oceans.
Yes, we are so far apart and we're on different days. It's very exciting that we are able to, be awake at the same time. But I actually got a chance to meet you earlier this year in Washington, D.C., and I've just re-listened to your presentation, which was wonderful. And we're going to get into a whole bunch of your expertise in the area of adoption. And why don't we start out with this, though? Could you share your story with us?
Yes, certainly, Haley. I was born in 1957, which is quite some time ago now, and always knew I was adopted. As a young child, I used to be read the Chosen Baby story by Belina Wasson, which, I was very disturbed to see was still in edition in 1986 with a new cover. But that talks about a Mr. and Mrs. Brown who can't have children, and so they ring up Mrs. White to ask for a baby. I'm obviously Sue Green, so it was Mr. and Mrs. Green. And the book actually says, Mrs. White, we wish to find a baby who would like a mother and father and who could be our very own. And so in this whole story, there's nothing about our mothers and fathers. And as a child, I used to love this book, but I remember saying to my parents, was that before I was a piece of paper? Events that occurred before I came into their family. And it was like I understood I was a transaction or a legal contract. And being in the era of closed adoption wasn't talked about. I felt very guilty or bad for asking any questions. So I tried to fit in as best as I could. My parents were very loving. It's a good adoptive family. However, there were two differences to the Chosen Baby story. One is my father told me, rather than Mrs. White ringing up and we've got a baby for you, that they went along to the baby's home and I smiled to them from my cot and that I actually chose them, which is a different spin on it. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is that I was what's called in the literature the fertility charm, in that my parents had a homemade baby 4 years after me.
Okay. I have not heard that one yet.
It's very known in IVF circles.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And it's very sad, after my father died, I found this little packet of photos that I'd never seen before, and I'm holding a baby. I'm about 3.5 or 4, and it's not my brother. And my mother had actually had another baby on pre-adoptive placement when she conceived, and she needed to hand this baby back because she couldn't be pregnant and pre-adoptive. And she'd never spoken to anyone about this. So, in her older age, I was able to talk about that, and she had enormous grief and loss. And it's still one of my tasks is to try and find that little baby because I don't know what happened to him, but I have no recollection of holding him. Mm. Anyway, I'd probably say I had a pretty rocky adolescence. I was fairly non-compliant, and I was in 1F. We used to have 1A, B, C, D at school. I was in 1F for a while. Probably my saving grace, and my parents were probably mad, but I was absolutely horse mad. And I used to go to the auctions and buy unwanted horses that were very damaged and work with them. So I sort of did animal-assisted therapy before it was even invented. And somehow, once I got to the end of high school, there were very few people in our class. I actually passed and then left home and went to uni. And all my life through uni, I worked in bars, and people would come up to me and say, "Now, where are you from?" Or they'd start talking to me in Italian, or "You just look my cousin in North Verona," and so on. And I'd have to say, as all adoptees do, "I don't know I'm adopted. I don't know I'm adopted." So that led me to search. And the other thing that led me to search was I read Lost and Found by Betty Jean Lipton, which was the book of the day. And of course, it's got adolescent baggage, the chosen baby story, the right to know. And it was like that book was written to me. And, something we say in the adoption movement is there's been a professional silence and denial of adoption as an issue. And that the people that have spoken out about it, as you have talked about, talking the truth from the fairy tale, is the people with the experience, and particularly people like Betty Jean Lifton and Nancy Verrier and Joe Sol, and we've got our own Nancy Robinson, who's a mother in Australia, talking about their own personal experiences with a clinical bent. So those two things are really powerful to me. So growing up, I knew two things. I knew my parents had told me that my parents were married and that they lived in the country. So you know how we fantasize as we're growing up. I used to think I was a part of a large Italian or, family that grew vegetables, and they had a bad crop and they couldn't keep me. This was sort of my image, my fantasy.
Oh, that one bad crop, that'll really do you in.
And so, I knew I was placed in the Methodist Babies Home. So during this time, and I can't remember, it would have been the late 70s, early 80s, I went to the Methodist Babies Home to get my non-identifying information. And it's a very big, large Victorian building. And I was sitting there, and the social worker was in the desk opposite me, and she had my file there. And I was the good adoptee, and I just sat there, and she said, "Oh, excuse me, I just need to go and find something." And I didn't walk over and look at the paperwork because she wasn't allowed to tell me the name at that time.
So it was right there, but you didn't look.
No.
Now, okay, do you think she left to give you an opportunity, or she legitimately was just leaving?
I don't want to identify, but I think she left to give me an opportunity.
Wow.
It wasn't to tell me, but, the irony is when I found out my information, my mother knew my adoptive mother knew my mother's first name, and my father knew my last name because this was pre-1960 when they actually had the information of the parents and the family when they signed the adoption. But until I told them, they had never talked about that. So that's a sideline. So I drove home, as you could be imagining, just like feeling so upset and angry with myself. That's really when I got involved in the advocate movement for change of legislation. And they're an amazing group of people in an organisation called Jigsaw at the time who had been doing that for a long time. And it's actually a woman, Pauline Toner, who was previously my local member here, who introduced that legislation in 1984 for identifying information for adoptees. And it was a bipartisan approach, i.e. both sides of politics, like the Democrats and the Republicans, actually agreed on something.
So was this federal legislation or was it state?
Our
okay.
Adoption is run and managed, and the information is state-based. So we've got different legislations in all the different states. So I'm talking about Victoria at this time. And mothers and fathers, we don't use the term birth or first mothers. Mothers and fathers also advocated for that at the time, but they lost. There was lots of media around. They'd come and break up happy families. And there was also media around, there has to be something wrong with you if you're looking as an adoptee. And so that's why the counselling provision was in at that time.
So that you had to go for a counselling before you could search? Before they would give you any information?
Well, you got it that day, basically, because you had your name down and you would go and see a social worker, and she'd just talk about perhaps why you were wanting to search and give some preparation, which in some ways I think is a good thing, and then you would get your information. So it wasn't conditional.
Okay.
And, of course, there became a huge demand, and so they started doing just a group session, about that. And then Vanish was funded to self-search, which has been happening for 30 years. So that occurred. So I wrote to my mother and father, who were still alive at that time. I got my records and I discovered I'm the youngest of a very large group of siblings, and one of my brothers was actually with me at the time my mother gave me to the Methodist Babies Home, and I was actually there for 3 months. So I've actually had 3 names. My birth name was Marjorie, my name in the institution was Ivy, and then my adoptive parents called me Susan. And during that time, they had, in 57, it was almost like an orphanage. There probably would have been 20 or 30 children in that room, and they used to prop feed babies, i.e. not touch them, because there was this notion of attachment that, to able to attach to a new mother, you couldn't have had previous attachments. And, that's something I talk a lot about, is around the confusion between bonding and attachment, that with your mother in utero, you are bonding. Attachment occurs then with the developing relationship post-birth. And lots of people say, it was men that invented attachment theory because they hadn't experienced the bonding in utero.
Okay, that makes sense.
We still sort of have this fallacy. You see these, parents, adoptive prospective commissioning couples, either a surrogate or an adoptive person, the baby's born and they wanted the baby to attach to the mother. Well, it doesn't work that way. Attachment is a slow process. Bonding is something that's occurred for 9 months. Anyway, that was the theory during that time. And so I arranged to go and meet my parents, and the brother that was there at the time, I was lost to adoption. We don't use the term given up or whatever. We talk, so for parents, it's they lost their child to adoption, or for an adoptee, it was separated from family through adoption. So, very careful about language we use that's non-traumatising. Anyway, my brother took me round and I met my mother, and my father was very ill at the time. Meeting my mother was an astonishing experience. We've got the same eyes, the same sort of bubbliness, and she took me by the hand and took me out to show her vegetables, and I was a vegetable gardener and all this sort of thing, And I didn't talk for 24 hours after that event. I was just in total stunned, I suppose. And, of course, my mother said, oh, yes, and there's another one too. And so we have a lot of adoption in our large family.
So that was the story was true. They were married because you were the youngest.
And my father was a farmer.
Okay. And the vegetables were doing okay at the time of your meeting.
Yeah. We call that synchronicity, don't we? And so then one of my sisters got a dinner party together with my siblings. Sort of live all over Australia. It's a bit like the States, we're about the same size. So, and so not all of them was there, but I love Betty Jean Lifton's term twice born, because that's how I felt. I felt like the little baby in the crib again, and everyone going, oh, doesn't she look like so-and-so? And, oh, you do this just like so-and-so. And we as adoptees never have that relational experience of being the baby in the, you know. And the other thing was they all sat there drinking wine, and after the meal they left their plate there and the table was in disarray. I grew up in a family where it was temperature, we didn't drink. And the meals would be cleaned up and the breakfast set for morning, the minute after. Cleanliness is next to godliness. And so I felt this enormous sense of coming home. Both sets of my parents are now dead. So I've sort of been 30 years now connecting with various of my siblings. I think the struggle with it is I really agree that you have this false self when you're growing up in an adopted family that you have to accommodate, and how do you know what is you? And then when you meet your siblings, and it doesn't happen for everyone and your parents, you see how much commonality there is, and things that you were thought were fiercely independently yours aren't. So, that discovering who I am is still going on, and I really appreciate the relationships, particularly I have with some of my sisters around that. Yeah, that's basically my story.
So you were were you like just early 30s then when you first connected with your family?
Yeah, I got the legislation changed in 84. I then gave birth to a son who was disabled in 85, so that sort of put me on the back burner a little bit. And so I was around 31, 32 when I reached out.
And you're still in contact with some of your siblings then to this day?
Well, Facebook's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Well, there you go.
Yeah, but, the ones that live in Victoria, definitely. And I had a message got two sisters in another state that I got a message just the night before last from one of them. So, yes, I am still contact. I mean, the amazing thing is that my mother was quite old when she had me, and some of my oldest, only one brother knew about my existence. Some of them didn't even know about the other brother that was lost to adoption. My sisters think it's amazing that they didn't know my mother was pregnant, and because she was living in the household. But I think we forget that in those days you wore big smocks and you didn't proudly talk about your pregnancy. And they were 14, 15 and probably off doing their own stuff.
Right, yeah.
When I was born. But, I've been fortunate in that I've been accepted. But, you can never get back all those years that you didn't live with people, despite the commonalities. Yeah.
Isn't that the truth? Now, you were mentioning, and you've hinted a couple of times at this history you have with advocacy and kind of knowing, the insider stuff. Why don't you switch and tell us about your professional career and how did you come to be Dr. Sue Green and the expert that you are in this area?
I don't know that I'm an expert, but
okay.
Look, my first job after I did Masters in Psychology was running a small agency out of a shop front. Now, these days we have lots of counselling services in shop fronts, but, literally in a shopping centre, and it was one of the first family support funded services, family counselling services in Victoria. And because I knew people in the adoption network, I started getting referred all these teenagers that were adopted. And some of them were in our boys and girls' homes because they'd offended or whatever. So I used to just sit and say, do you ever feel stolen? Do you ever feel angry? Do you ever think about your mother and father? And they'd sit there and they'd go, you mean my real mother and father? And I said, yes. Does anyone talk to you about this? Are you confused? And so I would just have very open discussions with these kids because I knew as a teenager I had held all this in and I had no one to talk to. I mean, growing up, I think there was a boy up the road and he was an Indigenous child. And, of course, we've had the stolen generations with our Indigenous people. And I remember him at school being bullied and teased. You know, he's the only dark-skinned kid. So I didn't want to identify or talk with him, even though I knew he was adopted. But I knew no one else all through my school years. And, I mean, odds would be there would have been other adopted students there. But I just knew that, particularly in adolescence, you don't like talking to people about your inner feelings anyway. But this divided loyalty in adoption. So I would just talk to those kids. And, I mean, I worked at the children's court, which is for parents who, you know, drug taking or whatever, mediating for 19 years. And I would always ask the question, you know, have you had an experience related to adoption? And I actually saw some of those kids I saw 20 years earlier, you know, during that time. So it's something I've always had sort of feelers for. And I've always asked the question, and that's what we encourage all practitioners to do, to ask the question.
So, you fast forwarded because you're already a psychologist and then you're getting these referrals for these. What drew you to the field of psychology? Do you know? Like, did you want to know more about yourself?
Look, we had no career counselling then. I think I wanted to be a wool classer at one point. You know, that's in the shearing sheds. I wanted to be a mounted policewoman, but I was too short. I have no idea what drew me to psychology, but I'll tell you something, Hayley. We've had probably about 350 counsellors come through our training, and I would say 1 in 5 have an adoption experience, or they're married an adoptee, or their mother was, or, you know, they're related to adoption in some way. And I think it would be really interesting to research to know how many therapists go into the helping profession because they've had that experience. I do know that all my growing up, I was very sensitive to what was being said. I don't know. But yeah, I can't explain why I went into the profession. It wasn't because I want to work with adoption or I want to do clinical work. It was just
that part just came to you later.
It was a drift. I mean, I did sociology as well, and I did the sociology of prisons and so on. And then we were very lucky. We had a program, one of the early master's programs.
Well, I want to kind of switch gears because you were, you know, talking about just your experience with, you know, the courts and working with all of these very troubled kids, and then you see them later as adults. And how did you start really working with adult adoptees and understanding there's like this huge hole in care for them? And then in turn, training other therapists and psychologists to become not just adoption competent, but like adoptee competent.
Yeah. Look, I think it was being a part of the adoption community for so long and knowing everybody's experiences, knowing their experiences of going to therapy themselves and having to educate the therapists. And you know, if you talk about psychology training, and it'll probably be the same in social work, we didn't mention the word. I did 6 years and didn't mention the word adoption once. And yet, you know, past adoption, baby scoop era, there's plenty of us still around, all as walking adults who have needs, and yet it is unacknowledged. There's a professional silence about it. And I suppose that's something I've connected with. And just knowing, you know, the Victorian Adoption Network for Information and Self-Help, which I was involved with, I wasn't on the first committee, but that was made up of adoptive parents, adoptees and mothers, and we had some independents. It's now has donor-conceived and intercountry adoptees on it. But being involved in that community and even 30 years later, we still have so many unmet needs around funded counselling. We still have people searching. We have the ripple effect. We have the children now searching. So, we know there's enormous need there, but it's not acknowledged publicly. Although I'd have to say, with the apologies, the Senate inquiry, just last month there was in the Woman's Weekly, which is a very populist women's magazine in Australia, there was a story of a mother who lost her child to adoption who was also an adoptee. I might have had it wrong. I just skim-read it in the hairdressers the other day. But, we've had a lot of media, and my next training is going to be associated with the National Archives of Australia have this travelling exhibition without consent. And it's about the whole forced adoption era, and it's got adoptees and mothers and everyone's experiences and photographs and so on. And that's a travelling exhibition around Australia. So slowly we are having people acknowledge that if you say you're adopted, they don't just say, isn't that wonderful? Oh, I was reading something about that. And there's some connections of deeper understanding. But I'd have to say we've still got a long way to go, because in some states there's a real push to adopt children from out-of-home care. And my fundamental position is that why is adoption different from long-term foster care, permanent care? It cancels and falsifies the birth certificate. And, it suppresses the truth to support a fiction, as was said at the conference. And whether you're adopted from care, inter-country, donor conceived, I understand there's lots of embryos now that might be adopted, that the birth certificate is falsified. And so one of our issues is about having integrated birth certificates. So everybody's relationship to the child is on the birth certificate. So I'm not sure how I got onto this tangent now, but the understanding of adoption, the basic identity information is a lie, and it continues to be a lie in modern adoption.
Well, you answered a question that I had for you without even me asking, because so I live in Canada, and this year they had a Senate inquiry, and there was a recommendation made to give an apology for the post-war adoption era, and nothing really came of that. I don't know. It's sort of on pause. Yeah. So I'm not sure. I can't speak to it more than that. But so you were just saying that, Australia has had an apology, and we're going to talk about that a bit in more in recommended resources. And so you're seeing a bit of a shift. But interestingly, can you talk about the status of adoption in Australia right now? Because, it doesn't happen much. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, I gave my stats in the presentation at Washington. Now, across Australia in 2017-18, we had 330 adoptions. Now, that includes step-parent adoption, inter-country adoption, adoption from care, and local adoptions, which we'd call our infant adoptions. So if you're looking at infant adoptions, we had 32 that year. So there's 7 states, so you divide that by that. Now, Australian population's about 25 million, America's like 300 and so on. If you look at 1% of the population and our adoption rate, America, and I can't speak for Canada, is adopting at least, I think, 30 times that amount. I think there were 16,000 local adoptions, and overall about 78,000 if you include out-of-home care and everywhere else. So, yeah, adoption, but we've still got an issue with saying, they'll say past adoption is in the past because now we have open adoption. And there's a push for that, and we have some very powerful lobby groups, including some of our film stars like Hugh Jackman and Deborah Lee Furness and so on, who argue there's these children that need a home. And we would still argue open adoption actually doesn't make much difference when you are falsifying the birth certificate. You're not allowing a child to live with their name, and that when they turn 18, if they choose to be adopted, that's something they can do. Knowing that we have probably more adoption dispensations, i.e. people want to become unadopted through the court as people choosing. And we've had the whole stolen generation. So we had an apology for the stolen generations. That was our Indigenous children. There was a policy of genocide and assimilation by removing babies and placing them in white families.
So in Canada, we had similar called the 60s scoop in Canada.
Yeah.
And I think something similar again happened in the US.
Yeah. There was a Native American adoption project in 1957, which deliberately took Native American children and placed them in white families. So that has intergenerational trauma effect in our Indigenous community. And there was an apology prior to the past adoption policy for them. And one thing I noticed in the States, I was just quite shocked, is we always acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and respect elders past and present and emerging in acknowledgement that we took people's land and we took their children. So we have that whole history of acknowledgement as well as the acknowledgement of past forced adoptions. But I would still say that there's a very strong push for adoption in Australia because it does get sometimes linked to the abortion and it should be quite separate. There are all these children in care that need loving families. We have infertility still, 1 in 5. So there's a very powerful push around the adult's rights to parent as opposed to the child's rights. And so that's still an argument, I think, that just has to be argued over and over and over again.
That's interesting that there's like this swing back towards pushing for more adoption, because would you say that the apology perhaps has given mothers in temporary crisis more of a resources or more supports to parent instead of losing their child to adoption? Or am I just sort of stretching that a little bit?
If we're talking about the modern day, I would still say that we have very strong moral judgments. If you're taking drugs or homeless or, in the old days it was you had a child out of wedlock or whatever. And we don't provide support and grief counselling for those mothers and fathers and grandparents and families and siblings enough. And my big concern around open adoption is unless you support that family, they're not going to be able to have any ongoing contact, particularly when it's not in contact orders. At least in permanent care in Victoria, we have contact orders. So I still think we have a very strong ideology about being very judgmental to people who, for whatever way, are not coping. And we've got to recognise that parents in our child welfare system often have had parents who were raised in institutions that were also homeless. It's an intergenerational issue, poverty, often. It's not something that is necessarily their fault. We're born with inequalities.
Absolutely.
So I actually ran a training day in another state, which the mothers from past adoption wanted to organise. And it was a very interesting day because the acknowledgement of the loss and trauma of parents, I still think has a long way to go to, and the disenfranchised grief and so forth.
Can you tell us more about that? So you do training for both professionals who are actually working in, psychology or therapy of some kind, and also other people. So can you give us a scope of who you are doing training with and what sorts of things you're teaching?
Okay. So we run 2 days, and the first day is open to any professional working with people who might be homeless. So they might be a chaplain in jail. They might be working with the homeless, alcohol and drug services. And so what we cover in those days is what is forced adoption. Now, we would say that if in 1972 we had 10,000 adoptions, for example, very similar in the USA. If those people were supported by family, had access to abortion, child supporting parent payment, job opportunities, etc., they would not choose to adopt. So when we say we only have 32 across Australia now, we would say that, at least 9,680 adoptions were forced because they had no choice. Now, within that group, there are mothers who are tied to the bed, drugged, some really awful things happened, falsified consents, all those sorts of things. So we cover what does forced adoption mean. We then talk about the 7 core issues of adoption, and we also add mattering and trust. And then we hear about the experiences from mothers, adoptees, fathers, and adoptive parents about what has been the impact of adoption on them. And then we talk a lot about the values and myths around adoption and getting people to question their own values. Then we talk a little bit about the role of support groups, because they're fundamental. I mean, there's nothing like sitting with your peers and connecting and encouraging therapists, community workers to use that as an adjunct. And in fact, some of my training, I've actually had a mother with a therapist come, to the first day. So, and we also talk about search and support in the legislation, because I have found that most people in the community, whether they're a counsellor or a housing worker or whatever, don't know about the legislation, and how to approach that. And what would you need to do to support someone through search and contact?
Okay.
So they're the sort of things we cover the first day.
Before you go to day 2,
Mm-hmm.
I imagine you have people come to this who don't really know what they're getting into. And how wide do people's eyes get when they see those videos of adoptees sharing, or just the idea that there's a trauma that occurs when a child is separated from a parent? Like, what are those light bulb moments like?
Oh, look, it's really amazing, because you start getting, with face-to-face training, you might have 5 or 6 people around a table, and one will be an adoptee, one will be someone that's working in adoption, maybe either in search and support or actually arranging adoptions. You'll have some child welfare professionals, you'll have some general therapists. And what happens is there's the exchange of information, and often the adoptee or the mother or whoever start sharing their experience too, because they've seen it on screen. And, from the feedback we get is, I never understood that it was so complex. I'm going to look at this client in a different way now.
You can't unsee it, right? Once you
No.
know, you know. Okay.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. And that's the light bulb we want.
Absolutely. Okay. Sorry to interrupt. Why don't you tell us about day 2?
Oh, okay. So if you're a counsellor, you need to come to day 1 as well as day 2 to understand the context and just get all that sharing with others. On day 2, we talk about theories of adoption. And so we talk about genetic and goodness of fit theories, social role theory, narrative coherence theory, trauma theory, attachment theory, stress and coping theories, all the theories that are around. And we get people to quite thoroughly look at trauma theory in relation to that. And then we talk about, when an individual comes to you, how do you determine what is adoption related and not adoption related, particularly when you're talking about adults who, might be anything from 30 to 75. They've had huge amount of life experience as well as adoption, and how do those interplay and inform? So we talk about the 5 Ps, what are the presenting issues, and we very thoroughly talk about the difference between loss and grief and trauma and how to assess that using the DSM-5. We talk about what precipitated, what was now, why now? Is it the birth of a child? Is it you've just learnt you're adopted? Why are you coming to therapy now? We talk about the predisposing things. For example, what do you know about your adoption? Was it open in the family, closed in the family? Were you in an orphanage? How were you parented? How did you deal with the age you were told? What were you told? What were your fantasies? All that big picture that you need to know about a person. We talk about what are some of the perpetuating things. It might be feeling of shame, not having connection with anyone else with the experience, all those things. It might be a sudden outreach from a parent to you, because in Victoria, parents can also get identifying information. It's not only adoptees. Or DNA is a very common thing. And then what are all the protective factors for that person, if they've got supportive relationships, those sort of things. So we talk about the whole picture, and then we take some case examples and people have to sit down and discuss them and how would they work with that person. What questions would they want to ask? And, I've got now case feedback from quite a couple of hundred people just discussing this stuff. And then we talk about search and contact and someone's ready. So what would you need to consider in relation to that? How would you equip and support a person? And then we also specifically, as I said, talk about late discovery adoptees. You could do a whole day on that. In our Australian research, there's no definition of that. They use 12 in the Institute of Family Studies. But, we've had people, I think up to 80, discover they're adopted. And what does that do to you when you've lived that identity? And we also talk about genetic sexual attraction, which doesn't need to be sexual per se, but, me not talking to my mother was that overpowering sense of connection. Or we have a mother who talks about her son walking towards her that she hasn't met 30 years in bike gear, and she's got pinpricks all over her body as he comes, because she just knows. And that enormous, it doesn't happen for everybody, but people need to be equipped by the overwhelming domination of this event in your life and giving that space. And I think that's something we also talk about, the level of awareness. You may, and I still see today, some people who are adopted and they have no awareness that I think you'd be calling it still in the fog. They have no awareness that this might be related to whatever's happening in your life. And then you have emerging awareness, and then you have some people who are drowning in awareness, and adoption is everything. And then you have all the people that are in different stages of reconstructing and integrating and accepting loss. And so it's very important to be aware of where people are at also. So, that's a really big, complex picture to cover, but it gives people a taste, and it gets professionals talking about all this with one another.
Which it's so necessary. I don't know how many times we've talked about this on the show already, but you mentioned this at the top, you can, become a psychologist and literally never have adoption addressed in any of your classes.
Yep. And one thing, what are you going to go away with? Well, we want on the referral form a question. Have you had an experience related to adoption? Mm-hmm. And now we need to do that with all the genetic donation stuff.
Oh, yeah.
We need to have that on our intake.
Mm-hmm.
I went to the doctors last week, and the surgery has moved, and I had to fill in a new form. There was still nothing about adoption or, genetic heritage on the intake form. Now, that is just crazy to me. And then how do you sensitively ask the question? So we suggest, can you tell me about your family? Have there been significant losses in your life? That you keep it very broad, because you never know what you might be unpacking and where people are.
Mm-hmm.
And one pleasing thing is we've had a whole lot of people from the aged care sector come to the day one training, and Vanish has been also organising separate seminars. Adoption's been seen as a special group in aged care. And, as people go towards the end of their life stage and they're reflecting on life, that is a really important time of life because, these issues can emerge at any time.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay. Is there anything I didn't ask you about, Sue, that you really want to make sure you tell us before we go on to our resources?
Oh, look, I'd just say your program's wonderful because what I still think we don't acknowledge is adopted children go out to the adults and we have our own needs that are totally unrecognised. And, I went to the CASE training again, the National Training Initiative, and it's like you can work with these adoptive families and deal with their mental health issues. And I would say, no, you can't, because we still have those throughout our life. And it's actually the whole narrative and process of adoption that is the issue. It's the falsification of the birth certificate. It's not allowing the authenticity of the person to grow. From very young childhood, for having to fit in, all those sorts of things, really important to acknowledge. And so we just don't recognise all the needs that we have as adults when we have our first child, when we become grandparents, when we're dealing with relationships, we're dealing with families, the development of loyalty issues. We just do not acknowledge that. And so, I'm really grateful that you publicise this so some audience might hear.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so we are going to do our recommended resources, and mine is something that Sue mentioned earlier on. You referred to it several times, Vanish, which is the Victorian Adoption Network for information and self-help. So that's a great acronym. I mean, you got all the letters in there. So Sue is on the committee, which I'm assuming we might call that being on the board of directors, similar lingo. And if you go to their website, vanish.org.au, oh my word, there are so many resources linked there. And, some are Australia specific, but there's so many that absolutely apply to adopted people around the world. No matter what your situation, you can find something there. It's like it's a treasure trove. So if I'm ever looking for a resource in the future, like if I need, something, I'm snapping my fingers. If I need to come up with something for a recommended resource because I don't have anything, maybe I'll come here and look at your resource page. It's and if you're in Australia, especially in Victoria, make sure you go and check out how you can get involved, get connected, find out more about training through there. And the other thing that's linked on the resource page is your recommended resource. So why don't you go ahead and tell us about that, please?
Yes, look, I've recommended, every state government has made an apology, but I've recommended the YouTube clip of the national apology, which was delivered by Julia Gillard, who was our first Australian Prime Minister in March 2013. So we've now had our 6th anniversary. And you will see people from around Australia in the large hall of Parliament House. And there's a 5-minute version and a 20-minute version. But what was so impressive is she met people and she talked to them and she really understood. And if I have time, I can just read out a sentence or two.
Absolutely.
That applies to adoptees. She said, "To each of you that were adopted or removed, who were led to believe your mother had rejected you and who were denied the opportunity to grow up with your family and community of origin and to connect with your culture, we say sorry. We apologise to the sons and daughters who grew up not knowing how much you were wanted and loved. We acknowledge that many of you still experience a constant struggle with identity, uncertainty, and loss, and feel a persistent tension between loyalty to one family and yearning from another.
Mm.
So it was a very moving day.
I may have cried just watching the video of that apology. I mean, really, especially those lines that you read, it's so significant, right? Having your loss and grief acknowledged amazingly is somehow validating, and it's a part of our healing. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And oh my word, you have got to get Dr. Green over to teach your therapist, your psychologist, your social workers about how to be adoptee and adoption competent. Dr. Green, if people want to connect with you and figure out how to bring you over to North America, which is where most of our listeners are, or wherever, right? You're a world traveler. You get around. Where can we connect with you to find out more about training?
Well, I would suggest that you contact Vanish via the website. And I have to say I met some wonderful therapists who are also adoptees in North America that you've also had on your program, and it would be great to just partner up.
Absolutely. That would be awesome.
Concurrent work. Yeah. So feel free to contact Vanish.
So Vanish, the website again, I'm just going to repeat it, is vanish.org.au. And there's a contact info there. Yeah. And let us know, please, if you have anything coming up, and we will certainly share it on the Facebook page. You do have a training coming up in a couple weeks when we're recording this in November. So I will post information about that in the show notes so people can come and check that out if they're around or if they want to have an Australian vacation. Thank you so, so much, Sue. It's just been a real honor. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Hayley. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Bye-bye.
Oh my word. I could have interviewed Sue for like 5 hours. I hope that we can have her back to address some more of this in depth. I mean, we could do, I was joking around with her before we started. I was like, you could do like a 10-episode series with your level of expertise. So grateful for her time and sharing with us. I want to say another big thank you to my monthly partners on Patreon. Thank you so much. You guys are literally helping the show to continue, and so I'm so grateful for your ongoing support. If you want to stand with these really amazing people and say, yes, I think Adoptees On is valuable and I want it to continue, go to adopteeson.com/partner and you can find out more details there about your bonuses. And it's been really special. I've gotten to know so many of these supporters as friends in the Facebook group, and some people have Skyped with me, and that's been really fun too. So there's lots of fun bonuses over on Patreon. adopteeson.com/partner has details for that. Another amazing way to support the podcast for $0 is just to share an episode with a friend that you know is also adopted. Maybe there's a specific one that you know would really connect with them. Maybe you know an Australian adoptee and they would really love to hear Sue's story and get connected with local adoptees in their area. So that is another awesome way to share Adoptees On with other people just like us that need adoptee support. Thanks so much for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.